Guild Wars 1. I spent countless evenings as a young teenager at my uncle's place playing on his PC that managed to have an ATI Radeon graphics card. Guild Wars 1 was all kinds of special in an easy to consume, affordable, and approachable model. Not only did it feature legendary developers like the main developer behind StarCraft 1, James Finney, as a lead designer, the team was also led by Mike O'Brien of former Blizzard fame, known for coding the 3D engine in Warcraft 3 and being the wizard behind Battle.net. As a designer and founder of the company behind the whole impressive affair, ArenaNet, the team was strengthened by yet more Blizzard talent such as Patrick Wyatt and Jeff Strain. With this duo and many more talented, noteworthy developers and the funding of NCSoft to the amount of around an estimated $25 million in development cost, Guild Wars 1 would launch their first campaign April 2005. While Guild Wars 1 would be called by many outlets, incorrectly I might add, as an MMORPG against the actual reported definition and genre of the game, it was actually sold and developed as a co-RPG, or better yet known from the Japanese world as a MORPG. It's the older yet littler brother to the MMORPG genre. A more so cooperative-focused virtual world that doesn't have much focus, if any, on massive or large-base content. These games are also typically very instanced due to the architecture and design of them. Whether Guild Wars 1 took inspiration from Phantasy Star Online or simply learned from their time with Battle.net and benefited from PSO's innovations largely, like PSO, Guild Wars 1 was able to bring in a new fan base who didn't have a home in the virtual world space and lead the torch for MORPGs in the West. With the last expansion having launched August 2007 and the last major update being in 2018, and clearly it existing in a maintenance mode, with most of ArenaNet's focus being on their sequel title Guild Wars 2, which launched in 2012 and is still receiving updates and expansions. Although it shares the same name though, it's actually quite different than the Guild Wars that we are covering today. Nearly 20 years later, Guild Wars 1 has found itself on the Death of a Game series, a series where we search for the largest contributing factors to the death or failure of a particular game or company through the help of utilizing a timeline of events, obtaining the clues and bits of evidence along the way, finally culminating in a final deduction, every detective's favorite moment. Before we get to the case, it must be acknowledged that oftentimes people misunderstand the series and think that the main focus is somehow to be negative or only document failures. But sometimes games just die because they are old, or because the development team moved on to the sequel, or many more reasons that we will detail throughout this, because death doesn't only have a literal meaning. Think of the death analogy as someone dying of natural causes in this case versus some gruesome murder too. The point is, Guild Wars 1 isn't in this series because it was a failure in any capacity, but it's one of the most important virtual worlds in our history, and one that I have spent way too many thousands of hours playing and studying. It's important we document subsequently, along the normal lines of the series as described above, why Guild Wars 1 was so special and innovative, and why it should be remembered despite most having moved on from it. Let's get to the case though. Choose your class and dual class, and let's save Ascalon detectives. Spike on 3, 2, 1. The story begins with the founding of ArenaNet in 2000. ArenaNet was founded by Mike O'Brien, Patrick Wyatt, and Jeff Strain in Bellevue, Washington. All three coming from Blizzard Entertainment and working across multiple of their major titles. They would also feature some more prevalent Blizzard developers like James Finney, the brainchild behind StarCraft 1's design. The company would be originally called Triforge, but would quickly change to ArenaNet shortly after. At this time, Phantasy Star Online, another pioneer MORPG title, or MORPG title, was just launching and reaching its major success from Japan and then on globally, right at the turn of the century. This would make the market a perfect time for a Western equivalent style game, with some natural differences and innovations. While WoW hadn't launched yet, something people often forget or are unaware of is that many developers in the industry, on the know, were aware of the title before the players were. WoW was already known as early as the early 2000s in rumblings. Guild Wars 1 had the ability, because of this, to position themselves as both the West's answer to PSO and an alternative title and play experience to WoW. NCSoft would acquire ArenaNet off the strength of them working on the technology required to build the game they wanted. My assumption is ArenaNet was able to showcase their channel-based world design, where each channel represented a different instance, and a collection of instances existed in different regions. Allegedly, this came from their experiences working with Battle.net, but I also must acknowledge that PSO had just accomplished this a year or so prior, so it was already known about on the market to an extent. I bet NCSoft, a Korean-based company, realized they essentially had a Japanese online-level RPG coming from a very talented Western development team with strong Blizzard roots. Talk about hitting gold for only $6 million to acquire the company, and then $25 million to build the game. Mike O'Brien, too, wasn't just a good leader, but was a top-shelf programmer, too. It should be remembered, as I said in the very beginning, O'Brien literally invented Battle.net, so when they talk about their innovations coming from that, my guess is they're more so talking about the map design, where you would load into each section and load the maps. But they also had James Finney, the lead developer behind StarCraft 1, which would later become a sport in Korea. So Korea must have had an insane amount of respect for the team on top of things, and a lot of general will to work with them. The early reports basically confirmed this. Richard Garriott, who was leading the NCSoft division in NA at the time, was swayed by the quality of the technology presented and the pedigree of its creators, and ultimately feared them being scooped up. Richard would even go on to say that they could revolutionize the business model for online games with such a game like this, which we have to give Richard credit because he was actually put in charge of NCSoft's NA division and helped orchestrate the acquisition and launch of Guild Wars 1 and other titles brought to the West from Korea and others created in the West. Richard also, in many ways, was right. And NCSoft at the time wasn't actually a big believer, and I'm sure many people had to do some convincing. But on top of those other things that I mentioned, it probably was much easier knowing that you're working with many of the same talent that made Blizzard who they were. The development for their upcoming multiplayer title, not yet announced publicly, would be announced in April 2003 and confirmed. And it would take ArenaNet 3.5 years to build their channel system and map download system, which would mimic the BattleNet system of loading into a lobby and having to load the maps. But after loading them once, you wouldn't have to load them again. This was an innovative system that allowed Guild Wars 1 to stream content to players in more real time and thus reduce the cost of server fees. Within a year, Guild Wars 1, ArenaNet's first virtual world and online RPG, would be revealed to the public in April of 2004. Guild Wars 1 was meant to be the game you could play 30 minutes before dinner, without needing to schedule a whole day or night for a session. It was intentionally designed to be more cooperative, encouraging players to work together to complete the various zones before reaching the next zone and hub zone, and the various PvE content in between those zones. And of course, the PvP modes. After the public reveal, ArenaNet would, in a stroke of genius, exhibit some of the smartest word-of-mouth marketing we have seen and honestly might have led the way for it in general. They would, during E3's convention, RIP E3, host an open beta test demo that would allow for players from the floor to play with other testers that were invited, a practice that would actually become commonplace in future conventions and testing systems, and I know from personal experience. Up to 200k players would test the game over the course of 5 days, while the game was still being viewed on the floor of E3. Why word of mouth is so important can't be understated. It's the most important marketing in virtual world gaming, because it gets you in the door most of the time. A sense of community, FOMO, and other exciting things that come with joining a new world also are a part of the picture. But once you're bought in, there's a much higher chance that you'll stay bought in. That's kind of how virtual worlds work. If only corporations would just heed this advice and realize no matter how much dozens of millions you throw at a game, if it doesn't have a positive word-of-mouth marketing and it's not actually a good game, and good games don't get magical good word-of-mouth marketing organically, you aren't going to reach that targeted goal that you have. Sorry. And there's many examples that show this to be true, like how Dead Space 3 sold well but didn't meet the publisher expectations due to the inordinate amount of money spent on marketing it, so they weren't happy about it. This is even more important for virtual worlds because nobody is going to join a world that's already faltering at the start, and if it has a bad reputation from the get-go. ArenaNet, though, wasn't just a hype job. They were proving publicly that their product worked, with all the confidence in the world behind it. This also allowed them to build a core audience before their game even came out, which is also important for a virtual world, and really any brick-and-mortar place of business, which is how virtual worlds in many ways should be compared to. Guild Wars 1 would launch, well, the first campaign set in a series of campaigns to launch would launch as the base platform in a sense April 2005. Dubbed Guild Wars Prophecies, Prophecies would not only set the tone for what the game would be, and tell the prophecies, it would set the tone of how the story and subsequent stories would be handled. Prophecies was a stroke of genius, even my bias aside, because it did something other virtual worlds did good, but it did better. It opens up with a well-taught and designed tutorial system that is essentially a prequel. This tutorial is an entire zone and world, and it teaches you how to play as you progress through the story. This culminates eventually in the story with you leaving this time period dubbed the pre-searing. That's because after the tutorial expires, you essentially realize the world you just learned about and experienced, spoiler 20 years later, will never be the same after the searing, with the introduction of the char. But the best part is, you guys might think a tutorial locks you into a pre-time period, and that sounds restrictive, but many legendary nerds would even grind max level in the pre-searing phase. Yes, just like that South Park episode where they keep killing boars to hit max level in WoW. The actual minute-to-minute gameplay in Guild Wars 1 and map design was incredibly similar to Phantasy Star Online, specifically their sequel map design, and even Diablo to an extent, which Phantasy Star Online was made to mimic, meaning that Guild Wars 1 was actually an innovation to PSO in that respect and could have led to PSO evolving towards that in some ways later on with PSO 2. You would travel from zone to zone encountering new quests and NPCs. In different zones, there would be hub zones, which were effectively cities that you could meet other players to then traverse these dangerous zones. These zones would get stronger in level and would present unique threats throughout them, including bosses with unique skills and unique strategies. The actual gameplay itself is classic tap target mouse click style, where WASD or movement keys is kind of suboptimal, and jumping as a feature literally doesn't exist. The gameplay is fairly rudimentary, upon first glance. Then you realize the genius of the combat in Guild Wars 1 isn't because it's flashy and fast-moving and fluid. It doesn't come with the 360 no-scopes and the fast-paced button-pushing stuff. It actually comes with what we call big brain build wars. Yes, Guild Wars is often called build wars. It's a turbo nerd like me's wet dream. Tons of game modes utilizing multiple people on teams and a dual class system where you could combine two classes into a unique class in itself. To contrast, this is not the same as a hybrid class. These are two straight classes combined together. Prophecies would launch with 6 of these classes, or professions as they were called. Warrior, a balanced and tough archetype who would utilize signets and pressure to win fights. The Ranger, who could utilize various escape skills, poisons, and special crowd control to beat its opponents. The Monk, who specialized in healing and protecting its teammates. The Necromancer, who was about debilitating its enemies and healing itself with the stolen life from them, as well as summoning creatures to fight for you. And the Mesmer, arguably the most unique class in Guild Wars 1 base, which was a support DPS who specialized in largely making people suffer in a multitude of ways, like backfiring spells or making people share damage. Finally, you would have the Elementalist, arguably the most famous Guild Wars profession that utilizes the 4 elements and a multitude of different ways to summon spells and buffs. You could use whatever weapons you wanted with your class, so you could create crazy classes and new archetypes like the Bunny Thumper, where you're a ranger and a warrior rampaging with a giant hammer knocking people down, or a touch ranger / necro who focuses on stealing life and kind of being annoying. Sorry, I like those two. You could effectively, though, create new classes, playstyles, and archetypes all together because of the sheer amount of playability in the game. But you weren't just limited to the classes that you chose. You could, with the PvE portion of the game, through the use of the skill signet, unlock new skills littered throughout the world, including boss fights that would give you elite skills, in which a player is then granted that elite skill or ultimate ability. This skill acquisition system combined with dual classing and a non-restricted weapon system made Guild Wars 1 incredibly impressive gameplay-wise. This means that even though Build Wars and the concept of it might seem limiting in some ways, the amount of gameplay and variety of play in Guild Wars 1 is some of the most I've ever seen in any virtual world ever. Guild Wars 1 offers some of the best gameplay for strategy-focused players, and this was perfect for the time, when many virtual worlds and MMOs were still focusing largely on that. This is particularly cool because the lead designer of the game was the creator of StarCraft 1, which is another of my favorite games and favorite strategy games, and it also means that James just knows how to make strategy games. But although PvE and cooperative play intuitively seem like the only and main way to play Guild Wars 1, and don't get me wrong, the PvE is worth going through at least once even if you missed it the first time around, detectives. But I think that the biggest surprise that came from Guild Wars 1 and red-pilled the rest of my life was how good the PvP was. Cooperation isn't just about fighting monsters or AI, it's about fighting other players too. And Guild Wars 1, and I will be on record saying this, has the single greatest amount of PvP content and variety out of any other MMO or MMORPG. It's not even close, and the PvP itself, as imagined from the skill system and strategy mentioned above, is incredibly team-focused, incredibly unique, and incredibly in-depth. I will attempt to cover how insanely stacked it actually is in quick time. Guild Wars 1 not only had local PvP arenas specific to each level range of the area you were playing in, it had an incredible amount of PvP modes outside of that to participate in. While you could play this with your PvE character that you could level to max level, which was level 20, you could also just create a PvP character. The downside is that you wouldn't have all of these skills unlocked. But the way the PvP system worked on top of that was genius. You would start with random arenas upon reaching that max level. Then upon winning enough matches, you could unlock team arenas. And then with Team Arena, you could unlock the Hero Ascent system. Random arenas on top of that were randomized solo queue teams, team arenas were pre-mades, and then Hall of Heroes was this 8 vs 8 strategic battle over the course of multiple map trials that must be completed. Then you had things like faction PvP with Fort Aspenwood, and then Jade Quarry, alliance battles, the Hero Arena or the Codex Arena, because they changed the name later on. And finally, the big dog of Guild Wars and the bearer of its name, Guild vs. Guild or Guild Wars. With Guild vs. Guild as it was dubbed, you had 8 vs. 8 taking place in various maps that players could choose for themselves as their guild home or guild hall, and then must defend. Each of these guild halls had different mechanics, and Guild vs. Guild was essentially fighting people in their favorite map, while having them to have to fight you on yours shortly after. Guild vs. Guild wasn't just deathmatch, there was unique objectives depending on the guild hall. And you also had the rally or the flag mechanic system. Once you ran a flag properly, you could obtain an overall health and energy buff called a morale boost. So you have 8 players, one being a flag runner, one being a splitter, or a player that runs from area to assist. I played the split player, aka Interrupt Rangers, who specialized in winning fights with my elite interrupting abilities. If I was able to interrupt a monk's healing spell, I would disable it and them for a while, allowing me to likely secure a kill for my team. Of the remaining 6 roles, you would typically have 2 monks or support players, one playing a traditional healing role and the other playing a prop monk, which was unique to Guild Wars 1. Prop monks, or protection monk, would preemptively block damage and were very difficult to deal with. Of the remaining 4, this is where the variety differs the most, because they're usually led by a warrior with a res signet or some kind of assassin who then charges in to attempt to find targets. Guild vs. Guild though is incredible and so complex. It's easily the most fun I've had in a PvP game mode. Because it's guild based, it has a ranking system that if you're ranked high enough you get invited to high level tournaments that you can then win trims on your cape for, gold trim being the most impressive one. But there's also pride on the line for defending your own hall because it's guild based. It just made me think about PvP in a strategic way that no other game has. GVG is so big brain that you have entire websites dedicated to explaining the builds and how they work and different strategies. And there was even a spectator system, where shitty players like me would spend hours trying to watch other players on the top ladder and learn how to play the game. And you could not only learn how to play the game, you could learn what builds they were using in that game. Craziest part of it all is that nobody expected Guild Wars 1 to be this good at PvP, let alone organically grow into a literal esport. Yeah, you heard that right, and you might have not even known it. Guild vs. Guild got so popular that ArenaNet started hosting 6-figure tournaments yearly that you had to qualify for over the course of that year. Almost seemingly by accident, Guild Wars 1 was able to become PvP royalty in a virtual world esport, despite being so PvE front-facing and so approachable as a game. Which is not only impressive, it hasn't ever been replicated again, not even by the sequel. Guild Wars 1 managed to be way more approachable than its sequel despite being such a big brain complicated game. And that's where people don't understand the genius of Guild Wars 1's PvP, it's how accessible it ultimately was. There was even sections you could go that would teach you literally how to play the game, let you play against bots and play with bots, and also teach you some of the important mechanics on each of the maps. Let's tackle some of the critical coverage regarding Guild Wars 1 though. Guild Wars 1 was able to score an impressive 89 out of 100 from 53 different critics. This makes it one of the highest rated virtual worlds ever. Eurogamer's founder would review Guild Wars 1 in a fantastic example of how media should handle virtual worlds, including in a pioneering sense. For starters, they acknowledged, unlike many outlets at the time, that Guild Wars 1 wasn't an MMO, and it wasn't even designed as one. I mean, MMORPG barely was even codified as a term yet, for starters. But unlike many modern fans, for some reason, who find issue that not all virtual worlds are the massive ones, the reviewer would correctly state that essentially by dropping the more standard MMO tropes, it makes Guild Wars a hybrid of a team-based RPG Unreal Tournament and party-based RPG adventure, with you skipping between 2 modes depending on your whims. The Eurogamer review also acknowledges ArenaNet's plans for future content, which would reportedly be planning regular expansions every 6 to 9 months. Wow, talk about a difference in expectations compared to the modern times, eh guys? Especially with the whole live service stuff lately. Many other popular outlets and mainstream media spots would dub Guild Wars 1 an MMORPG incorrectly or ignorantly, which would likely doom it to be incorrectly called such for the majority of the rest of its life. This is why umbrella terms suck. They rob you of the details of whatever it is that you're discussing and categorizing, and why proper genre titles and the gatekeeping of them matter. This isn't semantics. Guild Wars 1 has hub zones with channels and a non-seamless open world. By design, you could essentially run through the open world by yourself. By design and architecture, it's not massive, and that's on purpose, and that's what made it so great and unique and successful, monetarily I might add. It also gives it an insanely high shelf life with low cost to operate compared to most MMORPGs just like PSO. ArenaNet was able to sell 1 million copies, meaning that they were already positive on their budget by a solid 300,000 copies. That's with only having a box price and not requiring a subscription fee, which was so unique at the time that NCSoft, their boss, didn't even believe in it yet. And it was also without having to have a microtransaction store. The first bit of content added wasn't actually the next expansion, or a campaign as it was dubbed in Guild Wars 1. It was Sorrow's Furnace, added September 2005, which is a new location that allows you to participate in some new quests and deal with the Stone Summit Dwarves in Summit Peak. I would describe Sorrow's Furnace kind of like an extended quest line and zone that introduces you to the dwarves more. The first campaign, dubbed that because it not only expands the game, but expands the story directly and can be purchased and played separately to the other campaigns, Factions, would launch April 2006. Factions is when I came to Guild Wars 1, and was my first bot campaign. Factions was impressive because not only did it come shortly after the launch of Prophecies, it totally changed the game. It added 13 new co-op missions, 5 challenge missions, 2 elite ones, 200 plus new quests, alliance battles, the Dragon Festival and the Cantha New Year, and finally 4 new regions, including Cantha, and 2 new professions. The Assassin was also a deadly addition to the game, which would allow players to use their ninja arts and debuffs to either help them escape or assassinate their targets. The Ritualist, another fairly unique class to Guild Wars 1, was a spirit-wielding spawning magic wielder who could use the spirits to either aid their teammates or harm their enemies. What Factions really did though was add a whole new PvP lifeblood to Guild Wars Prophecies, not only completely changing the meta, but totally spicing up the game in a way that would never be the same. I can never personally tell if Factions was an answer to the success and kind of random success of Guild Wars Prophecies PvP systems, or just ArenaNet was that talented to service both audiences and service them both incredibly effective at the same time, something they weren't able to do in Guild Wars 2. The new region introduced of Cantha is still to this day my favorite, and was recently featured in the Guild Wars 2 expansion End of Dragons. Within the same year, yeah, you heard that right, insanely right I might add, Guild Wars 1 would launch another campaign, Guild Wars Nightfall, October 2006. However, although Nightfall was originally quite received well, like Factions, it actually presented a number of serious problems that the game would never really recover from. Nightfall would add 5 new regions, 4 new guild halls, and 250 more quests. It would also introduce the Hero Arena, later renamed to the Codex Arena, and 2 new professions. The Dervish, a unique scythe-wielding, avatar-using mega buff monster, think the Revenant in the sense from Guild Wars 2, but with a scythe, and then the Paragon, a spear-wielding, buff-centric character. Both of these classes were incredibly unique, but it must be acknowledged they would kind of end up largely, in comp circles at least, being used as dual classes, and not the main class. And I think this is due to them both being kind of more so melee-centric support characters, and yes, although the Paragon throws its spear, it's pretty close range. The problem with Nightfall is that by that point, Guild Wars 1 had kind of shown their hand. They kind of reached the ceiling of sorts. They seemingly couldn't evolve their engine or gameplay anymore, and with the rise of World of Warcraft and many other MMORPGs, the larger brother variant, people were seeing the shortcomings of Guild Wars 1 more obviously. Lack of voice work and cinematics, slow-paced clunky gameplay, lack of proper challenge and PvE content for veterans of it, and no raids or dungeons really, or typical MMO content. Or at least not that much typical MMO content. Even the crafting in Guild Wars 1 is limited, and character customization is even more limited outside of the outfits. But besides just age and competition increasing, Guild Wars 1 Nightfall was problematic because it was almost like ArenaNet's attempt to make their game a little bit more massive. It featured dungeons, raids, and even more hard-centric content, which was actually positively received, including the super difficult to navigate Domain of Anguish zone. The thing about expansions though, and this has been proven time and time again, is that they don't really attract new players to the game. They usually service the old audiences. And the issue is more so in this case that, in those moments of the comparisons that were happening, ArenaNet had unknowingly compared themselves to games that they couldn't compete with. Compare raids and dungeons in Guild Wars 1 to raids and dungeons in WoW. Compare the zone design of Guild Wars 1 to WoW, and although it is impressive, they feel fairly lifeless or hostile only. Kind of like a Diablo game, or some sort of open-world single-player game. The sense of epicness and scale and cooperation in terms of the world wasn't there. Worse, Nightfall would introduce the hero system to the game, and I'm not quite sure why. I have a theory that perhaps ArenaNet realized that they wanted to pivot already and designed the heroes to make up for disruptions to player count and activity, but in reality it's probably just an idea of let's take the companion characters or henchmen who already existed in Guild Wars 1 and you could enlist their help to help you at the different hub zones in the hostile zones when you didn't have teammates, and then advance those into a sub-character that have their own ability sheets that you could customize. It ends up making Guild Wars 1 completely beatable solo. And while this might sound normal to many modern MMORPG fans, it completely changed the core essence of what Guild Wars 1 was about: cooperation. It wasn't actually designed to be played as a single-player game. That wouldn't have made it catch on to the degree that it did, and the way that it did, because it was meant to be played together. And for contrast and explanation, many MMORPGs don't even feel that way, despite allowing for it. What I mean is that many of them feel quite hostile, or not welcoming. Guild Wars 1 was different there. It welcomed players, and it made them naturally want to work together due to the design of the game. An example of innovative and unique cooperation is that there's something called runners in Guild Wars 1. This is a side tangent, but hear me out. These runners are different classes, usually elementalists or a ranger or maybe even a dervish, that can actually run players to the different hub zones to allow them to either progress their characters faster or get to those zones before they're necessarily supposed to. Because the maps are hostile, in order to reach the other part of the map or the other end of the map, you have to get through a lot of different monsters. These runners are essentially guides for players that help them get through to the next content. It's an insanely innovative system that no other game I've ever really heard of has done. But I digress. With the introduction of Heroes, ArenaNet essentially let turbo nerds like me not need other players to complete most of the content anymore. And now the game could be even more so compared to single-player RPGs, which, sorry, still even in the modern times, greatly outshine the multiplayer ones in their strengths. ArenaNet had put insane pressure on themselves to keep launching campaigns, and they succeeded at it. However, creating that amount of content at that level was difficult, especially for a comparatively smaller team, and there was a question of return on investment. This combined with technical debt on the engine and systems they were using, and realizing that in order to communicate the game's design they reportedly wanted, they had to change aspects of the game that couldn't be changed. Not to mention, it must be acknowledged that even though WoW was a different game, WoW was raising the bar for every MMO and MMORPG. For every virtual world, let alone. Guild Wars Utopia would form from the precipice of this. The idea was that what would later become Guild Wars 2 in many ways was this concept of allowing players to make choices that would change aspects of the game, but not just individually. More importantly, collective choices as a community, and having a branching, evolving story unfold over the course of months like Asheron's Call would feature for multiple years. Mike Zadarani, a former ArenaNet developer, would state that they realized in their pursuit of this goal that the tech would essentially not allow for such. To put in simple terms, ArenaNet realized they no longer wanted just a MMORPG or CoRPG. They wanted something that had massive aspects, or was an MMORPG altogether. Or perhaps they saw the variant of MMORPG they made a bit too restrictive, compared to the more modern day ones such as Final Fantasy XIV or Monster Hunter. Remember, PSO 1 to PSO 2 would evolve away from the lifeless hostile zones and actually add a slight open world element where you could encounter other players. Utopia was also set to add the Chronomancer class, a specification that would come later in Guild Wars 2. The campaign was supposed to be set in the Mists, which would also be featured later on. Wood and Potatoes did a video covering what lore was released concerning the cancelled expansion, but by the end of 2006, Utopia would be canned, and most of its content and assets repurposed into the next expansion, not campaign, Eye of the North, and what would later become Guild Wars 2. Eye of the North, the first expansion and non-campaign, meaning that you needed the other games to play it, would launch August 2007. Eye of the North was special, because it wasn't just the first expansion, it was the first expansion leading into the bonus content that would ultimately lead into what was Guild Wars 2. Eye of the North would impress and help Guild Wars in total move their sales to up to 5 million copies. It would introduce new armor sets, 100 new skills, 10 new heroes, 18 dungeons, and 124 new quests. Eye of the North would also introduce the Hall of Monuments system, which allowed you to obtain unique rewards and transfer some of those later on into Guild Wars 2. This was genius by ArenaNet. Instead of divorcing their two games like many developers incorrectly do, they would marry the two with the content, the rewards, and the story. This allowed players to prepare for the upcoming sequel by continuing to play the previous game, and it worked on me as I made sure to stack my Hall of Monuments properly. It also made players feel like the second game was still connected to the first game. The bonus mission pack, coming with 4 major stories concerning some of the more important heroes in the game, and characters of Guild Wars lore, such as Gwyn and Togo, would drop November 2007. And the interesting thing about the bonus mission pack is it's actually spearheaded by none other than Colin Johansson, who was a super Guild Wars 1 fan turned developer. Though to be clear, Colin is often given credit for all of Guild Wars 1 for some reason when he came much later. Though to his credit, the bonus mission pack was really well received, especially by lore nerds. The new story initiative post Eye of the North was specifically dubbed Guild Wars Beyond, and was set to be the story that connected the two games and ages together. After being plunged into a civil war, you find the White Mantle fighting against the Shining Blade rebels to control Krita, a neighbor to Ascalon. Guild Wars by this point had sold 6.5 million copies. This would mean, bare minimum, ArenaNet was able to 7x their return on investment. The Hearts of the North update would hit November 2010 and would feature Kieran and Gwyn yet again, and their relationship as it would unfold through the course of the Char vs. Ascalon war. Winds of Change would then hit half a year or so later on and would be the telling of the events in Cantha following the faction storyline. With these 3 major content updates, they would tackle stories into and from each surrounding area, places like Shiver Peak Mountains, Krita, Ascalon, and now Cantha. This would directly, story-wise, lead into the sequel of the game. Something else that ArenaNet was doing at the time too wasn't just moving on to the next game or trying to get people to move on story-wise. They were still updating previous classes and even doing massive reworks like they did to the Mesmer and the Dervish. This showed that ArenaNet wasn't just trying to shoehorn their audience into their next content and sequel and make money off of them. They still wanted to show that they loved and supported their first game and first world that got them there in the first place. And this is a crucial error that a majority of Western developers make, ones that don't have the benefit in many ways of learning from NCSoft, ironically, who is the king at doing this, releasing a sequel to a game but still supporting the first game. This is why Lineage 1 still to this day is making more money than the majority of the games that you guys think are far more successful than it, and it makes more money than its sequel, and has historically. Guild Wars 2 would launch August 2012, and clearly took the majority of ANET's focus away from Guild Wars 1. If we just look purely at update frequency, let alone consider how much time and money was spent on their new big sexy sequel. And when I say big sexy, I'm not understating it. Guild Wars 2 was huge, massive even, in many ways, and gorgeous at the same time. 2 things that Guild Wars 1 didn't really ever get accused of such. You could see the ideas of Guild Wars Utopia in full form in Guild Wars 2, which would feature a grand narrative that the community could take part in together, and would also offer personal story that allowed you to make some different decisions. But it wasn't just positive with Guild Wars 2, the supposed Utopia system was actually heavily criticized, in part due to how it was implemented, and how once it was missed, you essentially missed a massive and expensive moment of the story that you couldn't reliably repeat. Don't get me wrong, I don't know exactly why they couldn't repeat it, and why it took them 10 years to re-release the content, but anyway. On top of that, although the world PvP was a big addition to the Guild Wars universe, allowing far more players to play together than ever before, the overall PvP in Guild Wars 2, despite having the makings and engine to be better, the PvP scene in Guild Wars 2 died almost immediately. You can give it maybe 2 years, even with an esports push, contract, and money injected into it. But that's because it lacked all the community grassroots that Guild Wars 1 had. It lacked the approachability of it. It lacked proper tutorial and teaching systems. And it lacked the most important and defining modes of the game, Hall of Heroes and Guild vs. Guild. Yes, Guild Wars 2, with Guild in the name, didn't even have Guild Wars, and it was never explained as to why. The thing that made them the most unique in PvP, besides the equalized gear and stats, which was very much the Build Wars and Guild Wars. Instead, Guild Wars 2 would decide to go with a capture point style map that, ironically, only existed in like one mode in all of Guild Wars. Guild Wars 2 would take many years to receive features that Guild Wars 1 launched with or received within 1 year, so while I don't necessarily want to compare the 2 games as I just did, since they are very different, and Guild Wars 2 is far more of a modern MMORPG with massive elements in it, it should be mentioned that it has seemed so far that Guild Wars 2 has been successful, long-term, but for different reasons than its predecessor largely. This makes some classic Guild Wars 1 fans, like myself, a fan of Guild Wars 2 as well, feel a bit left out to dry. For example, dual classing was removed after Guild Wars 1, build loading took ages to drop as an update, you were restricted on which weapons you could use, the monk was removed from the game, and they completely changed the way combat worked, aka the Trinity system, completely invalidating the entire concept of Guild Wars 1 in many respects. Now don't get me wrong, Guild Wars 2's combat's amazing, and there's tons of big brain moments in it. The problem is that it's put in the body of a fucking race car, aka a fast-paced action engine that means that you have to have not only a big brain to play it at a high level, you have to be very fast-paced and twitch-centric with very fast reflexes. A recipe for people not only to not be very good at it and get frustrated, but get frustrated and quit when they do things like strike content or PvP because it feels like, wow, look at the jump between the normal content going into that content. The approachability and cooperation that Guild Wars 1 had was missing in some aspects in Guild Wars 2, but Guild Wars 2 made up for it in some aspects by doing public questing and allowing for players who enjoyed action combat to also enjoy the game, though perhaps too much in my opinion. Now, before recency bias-filled posters attack me for just having this opinion, it's not even just an opinion. Guild Wars 1 actually outsold Guild Wars 2. The last game mechanic update would happen in September of 2014. It would reduce the player counts needed to run popular modes, a sign of a deteriorating population, and apply dishonor to those that left matches. The last game content update would happen sometime in April of 2015 and would introduce the Proof of Legend system, which would allow you to unlock rare weapons or items. That wouldn't be the last update in Guild Wars 1 though, with a major graphics update hitting seemingly out of nowhere May 10th, 2018. This update would allow for players to access an advanced graphics tab, which would allow you to use the highest level of detail available and double the draw distance. It does surprisingly a lot to make an already 12-year-old game look prettier, which was remarkable. It's also a sign that the Guild Wars 1 community was just happy to get any sort of update, with even Guild Wars 2 fans celebrating for them too. It showed that ArenaNet still cared about Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars as a franchise, which you contrast to Epic's handling, for example, or mishandling of Unreal Tournament for contrast, and wow, what a stark one. Sorry, I'm never gonna not shit on Epic for that. ArenaNet wasn't only working on Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 reportedly though. They had many secret projects, some that never even really got started, and many if not all of which were cancelled. Due to this, and the less than stellar performance financially of Guild Wars 2 despite its actual success, NCSoft would announce major layoffs affecting ArenaNet. ArenaNet would have to lay off a whopping 143 employees and cancel the remaining projects that were still lingering. Mike O'Brien, who already took a step back from Guild Wars 2 in 2017, departed during this time. This would mark a strong amount of the original ArenaNet team also departing, either in these moments or previously. ArenaNet wasn't the same team anymore, and many of the talented developers that helped make the game what it was weren't there anymore. And I assume their repeated failures inside of the company outside of Guild Wars probably didn't help matters there. While there haven't been any major updates or updates past maintenance ones for Guild Wars 1 in some time, there were some rumors that came out recently, in March of 2024, concerning a third title being worked on, making Guild Wars a potential trilogy. This, alongside Guild Wars 2 still receiving regular content updates and expansions, means that Guild Wars 1 might be on the back burner and has been for a long time, but that Guild Wars as an IP and franchise is still alive and well. There's even a chance that ArenaNet might do something to Guild Wars 1, with the 20th anniversary right around the corner. So although this might have seemed like a sad episode, I feel like the tone is quite positive. Guild Wars 1 might have come and went largely, but it completely changed the industry, and its impact is still being actively felt today. With that music playing, we have reached the end of this episode, and although Guild Wars 1 is still technically alive, oh no, here come the comments, it was not only moved on from, world-wise and story-wise in terms of the timeline, it hasn't received any major updates in some time. So while I might not have a list of reasons the game necessarily failed, I will compile a list during this final deduction of things that I believe that held Guild Wars 1 back and contributed to it faltering eventually, or at least them moving on to the sequel. Especially when we spent most of this episode talking about how amazing and impactful the game is already. Well, age comes for all of us. It felt outdated quite quickly. Slow-paced gameplay. A sequel was released and the focus shifted. Limited by its engine and thus its container. Nightfall trivialized most of the content. Well, detectives, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? You can still go play Guild Wars 1 right now, and likely find the entire trilogy plus expansion for relatively cheap. Well, when it's on sale. I think it still runs you about $40 for the full collection, which I won't lie to you, is still quite steep. But it's way steeper trying to buy them individually, which is why I recommend finding it on sale and buying the full collection. I think ArenaNet should just make the game free, since Guild Wars 2's base game is free as well. Or at least in leading up to Guild Wars 3 perhaps change it, because the cost of the game is a significant barrier to people returning to the game if they lost their account, or joining for the first time. Thank you, Guild Wars. Thank you, ArenaNet. You guys built a game that not only changed the industry, you built a game that helped change my life. Thanks for watching, detectives, and I hope that you can sense some of my passion throughout this love piece for Guild Wars 1. Until the next case, and until the next Guild Wars.